So Pachamama then is a maternal deity, an earth being, a representation of an embodiment of sacred earth. And it is interesting on a number of different ways, some of the observations we can make. Number one, that Pachamama has survived Christianization, that people continue to talk about Pachamama today. Number two, that there's been, seems to be something of a revival. But number three, that in the 2008 Ecuadorian constitution, that Pachamama makes an appearance. It states nature or Pachamama, where life becomes real and reproduces itself, has the right to be integrally respected in its existence and to the maintenance and regeneration of its life cycles, structures, functions, and evolutionary processes. Now, of course, if you took out the Pachamama and sort of this idea of intrinsic right, this doesn't sound terribly, terribly unlike some environmentalist policies and statements, but the inclusion of Pachamama, an inherent right, I think does, right, kind of make this different, this idea of an intrinsic right to its own life as an entire earth entity and not just isolated parts like endangered species, and that's predicated in a spiritual concept of Pachamama. De la Cadena in this great reading mentions several other examples, such as in Bolivia when Evo Morales took power, the Aymara indigenous practitioners giving Pachamama offerings in acknowledgement of acceptance of his leadership, right? So offerings to the mother Pachamama, acknowledging political leader, this interesting fusion of environment, politics, and religion. Or the Yanacocha gold mine, where outside environmentalists and local people allied to stop a gold mine and highly, highly emphasized and publicized the idea of these mountains as sacred beings, which is definitely a pre-existing and long-running and since time immemorial concept of these mountains. One of the points De La Cadena brings up is, we could think of this as just leftist or environmentalist or ethnic politics, as anti-corporate politics or as worry about soil contamination in endangered species or as sort of an assertion of indigenous presence. But she says it's more than that as well. She says, some of the national political actors have tried to brush this away as sort of, oh, this is a remnant of our past. This isn't really authentic anymore. People don't really believe this anymore. Or this is something that outsiders are using as a veneer or something like that. But De La Cadena says, this is very clearly for people in their lives saying things like Azaguante will kill people if there's a mine there. They mean that literally, not just symbolically, and they mean that vividly. And in that regard, we're getting at a point where these sacred beings, whatever your personal belief in them, whether you do or don't believe in these religious or spiritual entities, for the people who do believe in them, these entities are real, right? And people interact with them from their perspective, and then that influences what decisions they make, for example, on a mine, right? So these entities become sort of real in the political world. And I don't mean real to say that they weren't real to begin with, but I guess real in the sense of real in the way that everybody else could look at that and say, oh, wow, okay, that it shifts from being just sort of a social construction of nature to now sort of a politically active presence, which brings up the broader concept of ontology. There's been a lot of work on what's called the ontological turn in anthropology in the last 10 years. I'm not going to require you to get heavy into the philosophy on this one. It's a bit beyond where we're going in this class and maybe not directly relevant, but it is an interesting line of work that tries to think through, among other things, thinking of nature views, not just as worldviews of many views of the same entity, of the same physical world, but instead the ways in which people, in a sense, live in different life worlds, experience entities very differently, and how that might cause us to rethink some of our baseline assumptions about culture and ecology in the work that we do, or about language. Really good example of this is the book How Forests Think by Eduardo Kohn. If you ever get a chance to read it, he talks about Runa ideas about communicating with forests and thinking forests, about Runa ideas about dogs that can have dreams, shamanic dreams as a result of hallucinogens and therefore communicate to humans about hunting, and how that might cause us to rethink language and whether or not it is the case that we only language with other human beings. So it's fascinating stuff, although not the direction I'm going with this lecture. So my point though is, or one of the points though that I want to get across with this example is that religion and spirituality, they're an important part of people's worldview. It's not the only part of people's worldview. There's a lot of different things that go into a culture's understanding of its landscape, personal experience, the findings of scientists, the way language is constructed, lots of different things. But certainly religion and sacred traditions are part of it. And in fact, those things tend to be holistically interconnected and affecting each other. And so you could do worse than spending a little bit of time thinking about religion and spirituality and trying to understand people's views of the environment. Because for some cultures, for many cultures, that is such an important and influential part of how they view nature, how they view the environment, as with the examples a moment ago with the Azaguante mountain and mining. Um, there's other, I think, logical reasons why this would be a useful topic of study when talking about culture and ecology. The vast majority of the world's population is religious in some form or another. The roughly 80% plus, although that may change with time as America continues to shift religiously as well as parts of Europe, but generally speaking, I don't see this completely changing anytime soon, with over 80% of the world's population identifying as some religion, if not multiple, actually. It would be a mistake to not consider religion. Now, of course, religion and spirituality for some people matter a great deal more than others in terms of fashioning their view of the environment. For some people, this may be nominal, right? It may be sort of in name only. But for some people, as we'll talk about in this module, it's a pretty significant part of their view of reality, and therefore a big part of how they view the environment. And since I study this specific topic, you have to learn about it. Just kidding. I actually really do think it's valuable and useful. So my point then, that I was making a minute ago, I put this slide out of order, I suppose. I should have been a couple of slides ago, but my point with worldviews is that they're made up of many different elements. Much like this house that I found, I think this was like a Pinterest picture or something, I don't know, popped up on a Google image search. Anyways, this house is made up of roof shingles and red bricks and granity brick covering things. You can tell I'm not a home constructor, all right? Also, probably can tell by the fact that I just called it a home constructor. I'm not a contractor, all right? But this has multiple different components it's built out of. And it's much the same with people's worldviews and with culture's worldviews more generally. People at the individual level are products, their worldviews are products of their culture, but they're also products of their own individual experiences, their families, their specific subcultures, and the blending of different cultural backgrounds. And for cultures as a whole, they're products of many different things. Their histories, the perceptions of their individual members, influential members, but certainly religion and sacred views certainly play a pretty significant role in constructing what we call worldview. And as a reminder, if I haven't covered this before in this class, I don't think I have, but I have in other classes, so Dunstan repeats are probably getting a little tired of this slide. But when we think of worldviews, it's really kind of got multiple different angles to it. It's got what is, right, the ontology side, how we know what is, the epistemology side, and what should be, values, right? Worldview is all of that. It's what is, how we know it, and what matters. And we saw that a lot with the Pachamama and Quechuan case studies, right? You had some of all of that, both what is in terms of these active being, sentient mountain beings, but also what should be, that they should be respected because they are powerful and because they're sacred, and that how we know that, right? That we can know that through things like sacred teachings. So whatever we call it, whether we choose to call it knowledge or beliefs or worldview or ontology, whatever term we use, the teachings that different cultures have, that virtually all cultures have, about sacred concepts and sacred beings often powerfully inform environmental views, environmental movements. Now, I want to clarify before we go much further in this topic what I mean by the term religion. We oftentimes in popular American English use religion as meaning specifically large organized religion. And you see that, for example, and when people use the term, "Oh, I'm spiritual but not religious," or "I'm more spiritual than religious," or the bumper stickers that you may have sometimes seen. I think maybe these were more popular in Texas when I lived there, but it's not about a religion, it's about a relationship, which was how some people chose to frame their Christianity. So there's plenty of examples where people use religion in a more narrow sense. As anthropologists, we use it in really the broadest possible sense. Religion is people's sacred worldview, their worldview about the supernatural. So yes, if somebody goes to Catholic Mass or takes part in the Hajj to Mecca, yes, that's religion. But one could also argue that people's ghost stories if they believe them seriously, are also religion, right? So beliefs and practices people have related to the supernatural are religion. So when I talk about religion and ecology, then I'm talking about not just large organized religions, but shamanism, magical traditions, all sorts of different spiritual traditions that different groups have. And when we look at those and ask what's the relationship between religion and ecology, I don't know if Facebook does this anymore, but the whole relationship status drop-down menu they used to have, I hate to be talking about Facebook at all, I don't particularly care for them. But anyways, the relationship of religion and ecology, we would have to say it's complicated. And we'll talk all about that in the next lecture.